Hi, Chanel.
Hi, Shawn.
I believe I am ready.
All right, we've got 2 more minutes before
Okay.
noon officially. So we'll start in a couple seconds. How was the conference in Abu Dhabi? Right? That's where you were a couple weeks ago?
Yeah. It was very interesting. And there was yeah, it was 10,000 people. There were a lot.
Oh my gosh. Wow. That's
Yeah,
incredible.
yeah. A lot of people, a lot of talks. There was a lot of mention of complete ecosystems with keystone species. So I saw actually pictures of sea otters in different talks, which was really great. But it was all about worldwide conservation of nature and protecting biodiversity and conserving wild places through ecosystem recovery. So we've really come to that place, which is great. So yeah, it was
Wow.
very much um, what we're trying to do in Oregon. So yeah.
Yay. All
Yay,
full circle.
full circle. And I'm going to blur my background. There we go.
Okay, 1 more minute. All right, here we go. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 2025 Elakha Alliance Virtual Science Symposium. My name is Shawn Larson. I'm the Director of Outreach and Community Relations for the Elakha Alliance. And we put on this fall symposium every year, and we are a nonprofit based in Oregon working to make our marine and coastal ecosystems and communities more robust and resilient by restoring a healthy population of sea otters back to the Oregon coast. And we are excited for our next speaker. Oops, sorry, I went backwards. There we go. Dr. Shawn Larson. She is the Senior Conservation Research Manager at the Seattle Aquarium. She's been working with sea otters for almost 30 years, focusing on sea otter reproduction, population genetics, diet characteristics, nearshore ecology, and most recently, sea otters' role in mitigating climate change. So we're very excited for your talk today, Shawn.
Thank you, Chanel. Hi, everybody. I guess the first thing I need to do is successfully share my screen. So I'll do that. There we go. And start the presentation. There you go. So do you see the
Yes.
presentation mode? Okay, great. Okay, so I am here to talk about Chapter 6, which is titled A Catastrophic and Unintended Experiment, Revising Our Understanding of Sea Otters and Their Social and Ecological Importance Based on a System in Transition. So this is all about the fur trade. And this was led by Dr. Tim Tinker. I am not Dr. Tim Tinker. I am one of the co-authors, along with Dr. Ann Solomon and Ian Machetsky. Yes, Makensky, I think. Sorry about that. So Tim wanted to start with acknowledging a person that we've heard a lot about today, mentioned in every talk, and that is the one who began the story, the pioneer in sea otter ecology and biology, Dr. James Estes, and he was the one who first started studying sea otters in the Aleutian Islands and noticed that areas with sea otters, the ecosystem was very different from the areas without sea otters. So in the islands where he saw sea otters, he saw healthy, diverse kelp forest ecosystems. And in the areas where there weren't sea otters, there were urchin barrens. And I would argue that every sea otter biologist and ecologist today has been influenced directly or indirectly by Dr. Jim Estes. And we all have built on the foundational knowledge that he established. So, what was the fur trade? The fur trade was not one, but two massive experiments. So the first was the pre-fur trade system where pre-1940s, where sea otters were thought to be, especially in the Aleutian Change, probably at equilibrium density or at high numbers. And then we have the fur trade removal experiment, a massive unintended removal experiment that lasted from 1740 to about 1911, when they were afforded international protection from hunting. So we had sea otters in abundance before the fur trade. Then fast forward to a massive removal experiment, which was the first trade, which in some estimations removed over 99% of the sea otters in the world, resulting in few scattered populations. But luckily, there were a few scattered populations that escaped hunting, and those were in very remote areas where the maritime fur trade ships could not access them. And then we have, after protections were in place, we have the recovery experiment. And this happened at varying levels in different places. And this is what Jim Estes was documenting, is the sea otters recovering in the Aleutian chain at varying levels. So a few important concepts about experiments is you have treatment replicants or removal replicants in this case, and then you have control replicants where things are left alone. So you can compare the two. Well, those are designed experiments, but we could say that the fur trade was more like a dumpster fire. It was not designed. It just happened. But because of the massive treatment replicates, we were able to see what happened over time, because we did have treatments where there were areas without sea otters, and then over time we had areas where there were sea otters. So we could see with the luxury of time the before and after control and treatments. And there have been other removal and addition experiments in ecology, most notably Dr. Bob Payne, who removed sea stars from intertidal areas along the outer Washington coast. And what he found was similar to what we've seen with the removal of other keystone species, is that when you remove that apex predator that is structuring the ecosystem, what you see is a reduction in biodiversity. So what Bob saw on the outer coast of Washington when he removed the sea stars is those intertidal areas became less diverse and became very abundant with one species, mostly mussels. And the critical things that we want to point out, and we've heard it over and over again today with Jim's talk, with Matt's talk, and with Aaron's talk, is it's not the species, the removal of the species that is only lost, but it's the ecological relationships that are lost. And this diagram to the right here is just a very complicated diagram of all the connections within ecosystems, that the removal of sea otters, all of these red lines and the blue lines, those are lost when you remove that one predator. There are other systems in place, but ecosystems are very complex, and we're still learning. To Matt's point in his talk, we're still learning those interconnections, and that the systems don't all behave the same with the removal of the same species. So looking back in time, taking a big step back in time, sea otters in the North Pacific arrived on the scene about 1 million years ago, and they have a long history and coexistence with humans. But the human interactions didn't really occur until relatively recently in this timeline here. And so if we look at, we estimate that humans and sea otters have been interacting for about the last 10,000 years. You can see here, this is sea otters and indigenous peoples' interaction, the green part of the bar. And then the red is the fur trade experiment near extinction. And then here we are, the relatively recent time period is the 20th and 21st century of recovery, the post-fur trade era. So there was a lot more time that indigenous people and sea otters existed together compared to that massive experiment that was the fur trade, which was 200 years or so, but was really a blip in time. And then comparing that to the time that we've been able to have to watch sea otters recover is relatively short. And we're still in the middle of it. Sea otters are still recovering in many areas. So a little bit more, diving in a little bit more to that removal experiment. So at the time of the fur trade, there were two levels of sea otters. We think in the world at this time, there were those that were at equilibrium density, relatively high levels, or 100% of carrying capacity. And then we also had some that had been interacting with indigenous people and likely locally depleted, that maybe we're at a lower level of population K, or maybe 50%. We don't really know. But indigenous people certainly did have a history of using sea otters for their pelts, as a trade item, as a status symbol. And also they removed sea otters to for the ecological interactions with and without sea otters. So they would remove sea otters from areas, their clam gardens, where they wanted to maintain high levels of benthic invertebrates that sea otters tend to like to eat. But they also would allow sea otters to be maintained in adjacent areas because they also use the ecosystem services that sea otters provide: healthy kelp forest ecosystems, healthy eelgrass, etc. So relationships lost during the fur trade, certainly food web interactions. And the classic is the sea otter eating the sea urchin, recovering the kelp trophic cascade that we have heard about quite a bit today. And this is a figure from Estes et al. 1998 paper that Matt already showed us, but where you see the sea otters are in high abundance. We see sea urchin biomass low. We see a low level of sea urchin grazing rate on kelps, and we see a high kelp density. And then you remove the sea otters. That in this case, the sea otters were removed not by people, but by the orcas. And what we found is almost the opposite. So we have a decline in the sea otters, a dramatic increase in sea urchin biomass or urchin barrens, an increase in the urchin grazing rate, and a decrease in kelp density. But not only the sea urchin, the sea otter urchin kelp trophic cascade is lost, but also all the other interactions that occur when sea otters are in the nearshore. So there's our urchins, but also the sea otters connection. We heard about the recovery of the fish in areas where there's sea otters, but there's also habitat and food for some sea otter prey from crabs, clams, sea stars, and abalone, and then the interactions between sea otters and their predators, such as this brown bear, the wolf, the orca, and the eagle. So many species are impacted by this removal of sea otters from the ecosystem, both directly and indirectly. One of the relationships lost during the fur trade was the fact that the sea otters were controlling urchins, and then the urchins' effect on clathomorphum, or the reef-forming coralline algae. And this was brought to light by a paper by Rasher et al. In 2020 that showed where there were no or few otters around. And when there were otters and then the otters were removed, this grazing on the reef-forming coralline algae by urchins dramatically increased. And Rasher et al. Also speculated that this relationship with the urchins grazing on these reef-forming coralline algae will become more dramatic in the face of climate change. So in other words, in warming oceans and more acidic oceans, this destruction of these reef-forming algae is going to become more apparent. And Rasher et al. Suggested that in areas with sea otters might be able to mitigate that effect. Another relationship lost during the fur trade is that of genetics. Adaptive genetic diversity. So Pre-fur trade, there were approximately 300,000 sea otters in the world. And post fur trade, when it finally ceased, we estimate a 99% population decline of sea otters. Well, what happens when we remove 99% of the people or any other species that's going to go through a dramatic population bottleneck like this? It's hypothesized that they will lose genetic diversity, and sure enough, sea otters did lose genetic diversity post the fur trade, a 30 to 40% loss of pre-fur trade diversity. And with that loss, you also not only neutral genetic diversity which is what was measured there, but also you lose adaptive genes that control for immune function and disease response. So we're still not sure of the effect of losing adaptive genes will have on sea otters as they continue to fully recover from the fur trade. And I would like to say also not only the loss of adaptive genetic diversity, but also the loss of connectivity between sea otter populations. So right now, southern sea otters and northern sea otters are not connected anymore because there is that large gap of sea otter populations between Central California and Central Washington. Whereas pre-fur trade, there were sea otters all along the coast. With gene flow between those populations, with Oregon being a hybrid zone between the southern sea otter and the northern sea otter. And so hopefully with future translocations or fully recovered sea otter populations, we'll see that connection and gene flow once again. That will hopefully uh, help to recover the loss and genetic diversity that we saw following the fur trade. A huge relationship, not only ecological relationships that were lost, was the human sea otter connection. And this, I won't speak for indigenous people, but it is, thought that many traditions were lost from, and many stories were lost because it's been, in some areas, we're getting close to 150 years of communities that have not interacted with sea otters, and we're losing some of those stories about how it was when indigenous people had sea otters in their back door in the nearshore communities. And we're starting to recover some of those relationships, but only where sea otters have recovered. And the recovery experiment, we're still in the middle of it. So we've had some populations fully recover. We have some populations that are at moderate density, and we still have areas where sea otters are absent and low. It's thought that sea otters are about 50% recovered today, and that is based on not only where the sea otters occur. So where sea otters occur, there's still unoccupied habitat. A lot of those bays and estuaries, sea otters still haven't moved into. And also the absolute numbers from what we think pre-fur trade numbers compared to the sea otters today, we're about at halfway recovery. So we still have a lot to learn. And as sea otters recover, we're recovering and reestablishing those relationships between the areas where sea otters live and the ecological functions that they help recover. So we've talked about the sea otter, urchin, kelp forest, trophic cascade. But and then Aaron talked about the relationship of sea otters in eelgrass by removing the crabs, then freeing up the eelgrass, allowing the slugs to clean up the epiphytes so they can photosynthesize better, as well as the digging and disturbance that the sea otters have, increasing the genetic diversity of the eelgrass. And then that similarly, helping the sea otters helping to maintain salt marsh ecosystems by removing the crabs, which tend to destabilize those systems. And we just heard in the last talk about the number of invasive species like the green crabs that sea otters can consume. So there are many trophic interactions that we are just beginning to learn about as sea otters continue to recover into all the previously occupied habitats. One of the things that we didn't really know about until recently was the effects of other predators in the system. For example, the sunflower sea star or Pycnopodia. And to the right there is you see urchin density without sea otters or Pycnopodia, so no predators of urchins. You see high levels of urchins, and then you see high levels of, sorry, I'll go back, high levels of kelp consumption in areas with Pycnopodia only. And again, we would not know about these interactions if it weren't for the fur trade and the areas with and without sea otters, because we saw in Northern California and in Oregon without sea otters, but had Pycnopodia or sunflower sea stars before sea star wasting, we did see that Pycnopodia could have an effect on urchin density and on kelp consumption, but it was relatively small compared to that with otters only. So there are systems with just sea otters and no Pycnopodia, especially now post sea star wasting, because the Pycnopodia have not recovered yet fully. You see that otters do dramatically decrease the kelp consumption by urchins and then increase the kelp diversity, but even more so when they are both where they both occur. So they this combined effect when the ecosystem is complete with all of the levels of keystone species, those mesopredators and the top predators in play, then the effect on the ecosystem is more dramatic. Erin did a great job talking about this. I won't go into much of it, but just to show that, to say for those that missed Erin's talk just previous to this one, is that sea otters, with their digging and allowing space for eelgrass to reproduce sexually and allowing those empty spaces for those seeds to grow in, actually eelgrass is more genetically diverse and then supposedly more healthy in areas with sea otters than areas without sea otters. So rediscovering relationships, reestablishing and rediscovering relationships with the higher trophic levels. So sea otters as prey. I mean, we've heard about sea otters being eaten by orcas as they have shifted their feeding from the great whales offshore to more nearshore feeding on sea otters in the Aleutian chain. What we haven't heard about yet is great white shark predation limiting sea otter range expansion in California, but that has been widely established in California. The great whites don't eat the sea otters, but they mistake them for seals, and by the time they've tasted them and know that they're not a seal, the otters are essentially dead. We have new interactions with wolves consuming sea otters, and then also with the grizzly bear. Again, reestablishing those sea otter connections between the marine environment and the terrestrial environment. And what we've learned is that sea otters actually will change their behavior in response to predation. And this is called the landscape of fear. So sea otters will actually avoid areas where they know there are known predators of them. So this is the hot spots here in red are the areas of sea otter distribution in Adak Island and the Aleutian chain in 1992 before widespread predation by orcas. And then fast forward to 2015, and this is where sea otters occur now. And so they basically have reduced their distribution to areas that are protected from orca predation. So the sea otters will learn, and they will not occupy areas where they know that they are going to be consumed. Human relationships with, again, balancing recovery of sea otters and food security for coastal communities. So this is an area in Southeast Alaska where there was an increase in sea otters, a decrease in urchins, and an increase in kelp density. But with that increase in sea otters, there were decreases in certain valuable shellfish fisheries that then prompted an increase in otters harvested per year by the indigenous communities, which have an exemption in the MMPA that people with a certain quorum of indigenous blood are allowed to exclude sea otters and hunt them again to recover their cultural connection with sea otters. And they did this targeted removal of sea otters in a certain area, and what was found is here are sea otters in this area that the sea otters, after this hunting started, changed their distribution. So this is an area in Southeast Alaska. This is before increased hunting. You can see these darker hexagons are where sea otters occur. And then this area is where the hunting intensity was the highest. And fast forward, you can see the sea otters have moved away from this area of high hunting intensity, moving into other areas where they are not targeted. And because of this, there has been ecosystem changes for sure. And so these areas are going to be more otter free and perhaps have more benthic invertebrates that people want to harvest. And then these areas over here where the sea otters are moved and more dense, they're going to have more kelp forest ecosystems and more of the different types of ecological functioning that the sea otters bring in those areas. So there's been a lot of activity to try and recover the indigenous people's connection with the sea otter. The sea otter expanding the coastal voices of what it was like to live with sea otters and what it's like to interact with the sea otter, to not only harvest them, but also to benefit from this ecosystem services that sea otters provide. So this is an ongoing process. There's a lot of work that has been done in Southeast Alaska as well as British Columbia, and I would encourage you to go listen to these coastal voices that describe a lot of stories that indigenous people have with living with sea otters and living without sea otters. And yeah, this is just a little bit more of that. And there's Jim Estee sitting there with Bob Payne talking about what they've learned through the years about predator removal experiments, the sea otters and the sea stars, and how that changed how they thought about biology and ecology. So sea otters, again, are still recovering. We are in the transition zone. And because of that, what we know about today represents is a transient situation. So sea otters still have edges to their range as they expand. And we can see that at the edges of their range, this is a periphery of sea otters in Washington State. This is a raft of male sea otters that is being pushed to the edge of the range. And perhaps as sea otters move towards complete recovery, there may not be the edges to the range. So we may not see these large rafts of single sex areas. Maybe there will be, the sea otters will be partitioned differently, and it'll be less, it'll be more subtle and less obvious than it is now because sea otters still have unoccupied area to be pushed into and to move into. And so what they're eating is going to transition too. Initially, when sea otters move into an area, they have strong negative impacts on commercially fished shellfish. So here's a sea otter eating a large clam, a gooey duck, and then crabs, for example. But as time goes on, sea otters tend to diversify their habitat or diversify their diet. And then there are differences in the food web interactions too, including the strength of the interactions and the abundance and size of prey species, etc. That all changes as sea otters move towards equilibrium. And we're still learning about those changes in the system and the changes in the dynamics through time. So initially, sea otters are going to eat their preferred prey and have fewer species in their diet, but through time, then their diet diversifies and they start to eat many different diverse things. And this is just another example of how through time the system dynamics change. So initially there's going to be a bump in a lot of the kelps, but over time there's going to be a self-thinning. After initial return, there's going to be a re-equilibration of the ecosystem through time. And again, through time, there's going to be, like, there might be a decrease in crabs and some of the sea urchins prey, or sea otters prey, sorry. But through time, you're going to see a continued recovery of those species. Even though sea otters eat them, they're going to be more cryptic, they're going to be in cracks and crevices, and they're going to be in areas deeper than sea otters can dive. But there's going to be more food, habitat, and shelter because of the ecosystems that sea otters provide through their presence. And we have also heard about increases in fish species over time as well. And we've heard that in different areas, these systems behave differently. So this is Western Vancouver Island here, one area that has been, the benthic community has been studied, and then this is San Nicolas Island in Southern California, another area where sea otters have been studied, as well as the benthic community. And so both locations have long-term time series of subtidal community structure and sea otter reintroduction and population growth, but they both behave differently. And again, this is a very complicated figures about the complexities of the ecosystems, but where you see here, the negative bars are the red and the positives are the blue. But what you see here is this is a state where sea otters are absent. You still have the sunflower stars as a keystone species, as a predator driving some of these ecosystem connections. But they're different. And so there's a lot more of these interactions at play here down below in San Nicolas, where there's a lot more of these at play here on the top portion of this chart in northern Vancouver Island. And then when you bring otters in at a low level, you can see there's really negative interactions between sea otters and red urchins, and then a positive towards abalone and a positive towards kelps, etc. And then they're just different interactions in San Nicolas Island. So there's different complexities of which we're still trying to understand. So there's other species that are playing critical roles in these systems besides the sunflower stars and sea otters. That's what we think. Again, as Matt showed, as Jim talked about, and as Aaron showed, these systems are very complex, and we're learning more and more about them with more studies. And it's not as simple as the sea otter, urchin, kelp forest paradigm. There are lots of other things happening, and more work definitely needs to be done to understand all of those trophic interactions and ecosystem functioning. Because we're still in a system of transition. We are still discovering what fully recovered sea otter populations look like, their roles in the ecosystems, and the full scope of their ecological relationships. We wish it were simple. It's not. But what we do know and what we've heard today is that where sea otters are, the systems tend to be more biodiverse. There's more primary productivity, and there's positive influences on in bays and estuaries, positive influences on eelgrass and salt marshes, whereas previously it was thought that it was just a positive interaction of sea otters with kelp. So there's a lot more to be learned. And again, we don't know the full scope of those ecological relationships. So plenty of work still to be done on sea otter ecology, building on the foundation that Dr. Jim Estes started. So in conclusion, the fur trade was a massive unplanned removal experiment, followed by a subsequent recovery experiment that we are still experiencing. But what has happened thus far has informed much of, if not all, of what we know about sea otter ecology. And the number of relationships that were lost were countless. Ecological relationships, cultural relationships with indigenous people, the behavioral dynamics of sea otters themselves, the demographics, so those male groups with female groups, etc. And then the cascading consequences across coastal landscapes. We're still in the process of recovering those countless relationships. It's ongoing, and Tim speculates and hypothesizes that the relationships we have rediscovered will be far outnumbered by the ones we have yet to learn about. And again, to be in the middle of this massive recovery experiment that has taken the last 150 years to get to where we are today, just think of what the next 150 years will bring. And lastly, very few sea otter populations are fully recovered. Most are in a transitional state. I know the one in Washington is in a transitional state. Oregon still doesn't have sea otters. And many of the phenomena and the ecological relationships that we're seeing today represent transient dynamics. So we don't really know the full story. And the story keeps on changing. So in the Aleutian Islands, when we thought in the 70s that the sea otters were fully recovered, all we had to do was wait a couple decades, and the sea otters declined in the Aleutians because of orca predation. And now the sea otters aren't fully recovered in the Aleutian Islands. So that ecosystem still has to equilibrate. And what the ecological interactions will be like when finally the orcas and the sea otters and the kelp and the clathomorphon reef building algae, when it is all equilibrated, what the ecosystem will look like, we don't know yet because we're not there yet. And with that, I will take some questions. And again, this was Dr. Tinker's presentation. I hope I did it justice, and I hope I can answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
I'm sure Tim would be very proud of you, Shawn.
Okay, I'll stop sharing.
Okay. How do you define a fully recovered sea otter population?
That's a great question. And that would be one that is probably at equilibrium, is that carrying capacity, or K, is at equilibrium. And we're still trying to figure out what that is for many areas. And what Tim has written about, I mean, Tim has written so many papers, but he has written that carrying capacity, or K, or equilibrium for sea otters changes over time. So it changes based on ecosystem dynamics. So that's a great question. And I think it's when we're getting closer to So when sea otters have moved into all previously occupied habitats, so right now, for example, off of the Washington coast, which is a translocated population and has only been there for the past 50 years, they're still mostly on the outer rocky reef areas or on the outer coast and in some of the sandy areas in the central Washington, but they haven't moved into the big bays and estuaries yet. So they haven't moved into Willapa Bay. They haven't moved into Grace Harbor, all those areas. So I personally would consider sea otters recovered when they reoccupy all the habitats that previously had sea otters. So that's going to be the bays and estuaries, including the outer coast, including the populations that tend to raft up off the coast. And when they're stable, and when all of the area, there's no place left for range expansion, that would be a totally recovered sea otter population throughout the whole North Pacific.
Okay, Christine asks, hi, Shawn, what about Otter Point? When I was visiting the area, a gentleman told me that there were otters there, but I was not able to go and see that for myself.
Is that off of Oregon, Otter Point?
Yeah, there
Yeah.
is Otter Point. Yeah, you can go ahead.
Uh, so there are a few wandering sea otters that sometimes find themselves from Washington in Oregon. And I think there's been over 70 sea otters from Washington that have found themselves in off the Oregon coast. And there have been some in Newport near Otter Point. Um, but they don't stay. So we're we're hoping that they would stay, but they don't stay. And I think that when people say that they saw otters at Otter Point today, it's probably not a sea otter. It's probably a river otter that is foraging in the marine environment, which they do. So there are marine foraging river otters, but they are very different from sea otters. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, a lot of people email me saying they've seen
Yeah.
sea otters, quote unquote, along the Oregon coast, and 99.9% of the time, that is a North American river otter that they are viewing, which do swim and forage in the intertidal zone. So I can understand seeing a river otter in the ocean might be a little confusing.
Yes.
Um, but there was only one time out of 4.5 years that there were two actually live sea otters off of the coast of Ecola Point and Cannon Beach, and that was last year, July 2024. So it can be possible, as Shawn mentioned. Okay, another question. Can you share areas of Washington to watch different stages of otter population recovery?
Yes, I can. So sea otters, Jim mentioned this in his talk. So there's a initial reoccupation area in Washington where sea otters have been there for the longest period of time post translocation, and that's the core area. And that is an area just north and just south of La Push, Washington. So there's a great spot to see the core or the otters that have been there the longest, and it's a spot called Sandpoint, where you drive to the Ozette Ranger Station and you take a 3-mile hike along a beautiful boardwalk to Sandpoint, and you climb up on this big rock. Jim and I have been there many times to watch the sea otters forage and to count their abundance. And there can be anywhere from 20 sea otters to 200 sea otters in that area. And that is an area where sea otters have a more diversified diet. So they're thought to be, if there is any area in Washington where they're probably at equilibrium, it's probably that area, the core area. And there's areas to the south of that and to the northeast of that where sea otters are the periphery of their range. And those are areas where the sea otters haven't been there as long. And so they have plenty of food and they're moving around a bit. So there's a large raft off of Claylock around Destruction Island, but it's about a couple miles offshore. It'd be hard to see. But I've seen about 700 sea otters off of that area. And then there are a few otters off of the Reservation, Quinault Nation at an area called Point Grenville. That's actually the southernmost area. But If you want to stay to the north, there's a newly occupied area, an area called CQ, Clallam Bay. And this is last couple of years, it has started to reoccupy, sea otters have started to reoccupy there. And it's really fun to watch because we hypothesize that this is an area where newly weaned animals are dropped by their moms to learn how to be otters on their own. And so they're young animals that are just really playful and just always porpoising and frolicking together. And they're a pretty stable group. There's about 20 of them there, 15 to 20, with a couple of older chaperones, but most of these animals are younger. And it's really fun to watch them, and you can see them right from the road, right there between Clallam Bay and CQ. So that's what I would suggest if you wanted to see a newly occupied group of sea otters in Washington, go there. And for a more long-established population, go to Sandpoint.
I love that. I want to see some fun young weaning otters porpoising all over the place.
Yes, they're very fun to watch.
Okay, do we have any more questions for Shawn? There's one. Here we go. Oregon's history is pretty discriminatory, and this has shaped a lot of the culture we see here still today, specifically in regard to gun use and hunting. The reason I bring this up is because you mentioned the landscape of fear. I have to wonder how past human-sea otter interactions off the Oregon coast have influenced those wandering otters from staying. This was my first time hearing about the landscape of fear, but it makes perfect sense. Does the landscape of fear also include human-sea otter interactions?
Yes, certainly. And we did see that in we saw the landscape of fear in the Aleutian Islands from the orca predation, where they changed their distribution to areas where the orcas could not get them. And then we also saw the landscape of fear in Southeast Alaska, where the indigenous people were in the area where they were being hunted by indigenous people for their cultural reconnection. So yes, sea otters, whether being hunted by humans or orcas, will tend to change their behavior. And that is something that is new that we've learned because we weren't watching their behavior during the fur trade. I'm sure that probably happened then, but we don't have that data. So I don't think the sea otters from Washington that are wandering in Oregon have that mentality. I don't, they certainly haven't been hunted in Washington, so I don't think they would behave in a landscape of fear type situation. But I'm not sure, I don't know how long it would take to change their behavior if they were hunted. The reason why we think that sea otters don't stay in Oregon, or the one or two that found themselves down there haven't stayed, is because of shark bite. And we don't think that's going to continue if a larger group of animals is translocated, because they're going to be moved into areas that are sheltered from sharks. And also, if there's a larger group, the likelihood of some surviving is higher than if you're just one animal. I hope that answers your question.
Ew. I've got just a comment. So talking about shark bites, so we did have a lone male spotted off of the Oregon coast in 2021, a sea otter off of Yaquina Head, the lighthouse, the outstanding natural area, and he was around for about a couple weeks. And literally thousands of people came to Yaquina Head just to see that one single sea otter out there in the water. Unfortunately, he did wash ashore there with what was determined shark bite wounds, and the Oregon Coast Aquarium did take him in to try and save his life. Unfortunately, those shark bite wounds were too dramatic for him to survive. But somebody just mentioned that in the chat.
Mhm.
Okay.